I was 65 when love knocked on my door again. I wasn't looking for it. Not after losing Charles, my husband of 30 years. But when Raymond came along, kind and steady, saying all the right things about second chances and growing old together, I let myself believe. He told me I was his home after the storm, his reason to start over. And I wanted to believe him. Lord, I really did. We shared quiet dinners, long walks by the river, mornings that felt gentle again. But the thing about secrets is, they don't stay quiet forever. It started with small lies, phone calls that ended when I walked in, weekends that didn't add up, and before long, I learned the truth. I wasn't his second chance. I was his secret. And what I did after that, well, that's when my story truly began. I never thought I'd fall in love again. Not at 65. Not after losing the man I built my life with. Charles had been my world for 30 years. When he passed, it felt like the house went quiet in a way that never really left. People say time heals, but it doesn't, not really. It just teaches you how to live around the silence. Most of my days were simple then. I'd wake up, feed my cat, purl, make my coffee, and sit by the kitchen window overlooking the oak trees that framed my street. I liked the routine, the stillness of it. But some nights, especially when it rained, I'd catch myself talking to Charles out loud, just to fill the air. I wasn't lonely, not exactly, but I was untethered, like my heart hadn't found a place to rest since he left. That changed one Sunday morning at church. I almost didn't go that day. I'd been fighting off a headache and thought about staying home. But something nudged me, maybe habit, maybe God, and I went anyway. The sun was bright through the stained glass windows, and the choir sang, "Great is thy faithfulness." I remember thinking how comforting it felt, the way voices blended, how it made the empty parts of me feel a little less hollow. After service, the pastor invited everyone to the fellowship hall for coffee and pie. I stayed mostly to be polite, standing near the punch table, stirring sugar into my cup, though I didn't really want any. That's when a voice beside me said, "You take your coffee the same way I do. Too much sugar, not enough patience." I turned and met the kindest brown eyes I'd seen in years. He introduced himself as Raymond Brooks, recently moved to Charleston after retiring from his job in Atlanta. He was tall, with a gentle voice and laugh lines that deepened when he smiled. He said he'd lost his wife 5 years ago. Cancer. I could hear the ache in his voice when he said her name, and for a moment, it felt like we understood each other without needing to say a word. We talked that morning about small things. Music, family, the weather, but there was an ease between us that I hadn't felt in a long time. When I mentioned I'd been a teacher for 30 years, he chuckled and said, "So you're the reason kids still know their manners." I laughed, surprised at how natural it felt to smile again. Before we left, he asked if I ever walked the Riverside Trail near town. I told him I used to, back when my knees were kinder. He smiled and said, "Maybe they'll behave if you've got company." That week, we walked together. Just once at first, then again 2 days later, and then every Sunday after church. There was something peaceful about walking beside Raymond. We didn't rush to fill the silence. It was enough just to hear the river moving, the crunch of gravel beneath our shoes. He told me about his old job at a printing company, about how he missed working with his hands. I told him about the students who still sent me Christmas cards, about how I sometimes missed the sound of a classroom full of laughter. Some days, we'd stop at the bench under the willow tree where the river bends. He'd bring 2 thermoses of coffee, one for each of us, and tell stories about his childhood. How he once tried to build a tree house and fell through the floorboards, or how his mama made the best peach cobbler in the county. It was easy to laugh with him, but more than that, it was easy to be quiet with him. After Charles died, I'd forgotten what it felt like to sit beside someone and not have to talk, to just share the same air without feeling like you needed to fill it. Raymond had that kind of presence. Steady, soft-spoken. The kind that makes you feel seen, even when you're not saying a thing. One evening he came by with dinner, fried chicken, Collard greens, cornbread, all from his sister's recipe. We ate on the porch, the sound of cicadas humming through the air. He asked if I ever thought about leaving Charleston, maybe starting fresh somewhere new. I smiled and said, "At my age, starting fresh usually means rearranging the furniture." He laughed. That full, easy laugh of his, then looked at me for a long moment. "You ever think maybe you deserve more than just rearranged furniture?" Something in me paused. It had been years since anyone talked to me like that, with warmth, but also challenge. Like maybe he saw something in me I hadn't looked at in a long time. I didn't answer right away. I just looked out over the porch rail at the sky turning pink behind the trees. He reached over, gentle but sure, and rested his hand over mine. It wasn't bold, not even romantic in the usual sense. It just felt honest. I didn't pull away. From that night on, we were rarely apart. He'd pick me up for Sunday service, we'd share lunch at the little diner by the harbor, and sometimes he'd stop by just to fix things around the house. My leaky faucet, the broken gate hinge, even the squeaky screen door. He said, "If you're gonna let me hang around, might as well make myself useful." I teased him that he was just trying to earn more of my sweet tea, and he grinned. Maybe that's the truth. It wasn't long before he started feeling like part of my days. The little moments, the way he'd hum while washing dishes, how he'd bring me flowers from the farmer's market, how he'd leave notes on my fridge that said things like, "Don't forget your smile today." My daughter, Monique, noticed the change in me. "Mama, you look happy," she said one afternoon while helping me bake. "But you sure you're ready for this?" I told her I was taking things slow. Truth was, I didn't want to rush it. I was careful, the way women learn to be after heartbreak. But with Raymond, caution felt less like fear and more like grace. Like I was giving myself permission to feel again, one step at a time. By winter, we'd fallen into a rhythm. He'd drive me to choir practice, wait in the car reading his newspaper, and afterward we'd stop for pie at the diner. He never pressured, never pushed, just showed up, steady as the sunrise. One snowy night, we were sitting by the fireplace sipping cocoa. He looked at me, quiet for a moment, then said, "You ever think about how lucky we are to get a second chance? Most folks never do." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the fire. "I don't think I ever expected one," I said softly. He nodded, his eyes steady on mine. "Then maybe it's God's way of reminding you that life isn't finished giving." I don't know if it was the way he said it, or the look in his eyes, but something in me believed him. That night, after he left, I sat by the window watching the snow fall and thought about how far I'd come from that quiet house full of memories. I thought about how grief had shaped me, but maybe, just maybe, it hadn't ended me. When Raymond called the next morning just to say, "Good morning, beautiful," I laughed out loud. I hadn't laughed like that in years. Over the months that followed, I let my heart unclench. We went dancing once at a local jazz night. Just slow, swaying movements, nothing fancy. I was nervous at first, but he held me steady. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel old. I felt alive. He'd say things like, "You're my second chance, Evelyn. My heart got a little broken, but you fixed it." And maybe that's what I wanted to hear. That love wasn't just for the young. That maybe it could bloom again even in the last seasons of your life. By the time spring rolled in, we were inseparable. The garden I'd once tended alone was now ours. He built a small wooden bench for us to sit on in the evenings, and every time the sun went down, we'd sit together, watching the light fade. I remember thinking how beautiful it was to be seen again, to be cherished. And when he held my hand one evening and said, "Maybe we ought to make this forever," I didn't hesitate. After all, when you've been through enough storms, a little sunshine feels like a miracle. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have guessed, was that sometimes the sun shines, brightest right before the clouds roll back in, and mine were already gathering, Those months, those ordinary, steady months, felt like a kind of grace. Once the winter thawed and the crocuses pushed up through the garden, Raymond and I settled into a rhythm that made the days feel softer around the edges. He was there in the morning sometimes, padding across my kitchen with a thermos of coffee and a grin, saying, "Good morning, Evelyn," like it was the first thing he'd been waiting to say all night. I'd pretend not to notice how my heart did a small, pleased flip when he did. He kept his promises in the little ways that matter. Fixing the leaky gutter that had been dripping into my jasmine, tightening a loose stair that creaked, replacing the screen on the back door that caught and stuck every time the wind blew. He'd show up with a toolbox and a quiet confidence, and I'd stand on the porch with Pearl in my arms and watch him make the world behave more kindly for me. It was practical, yes, but it was also tender. There is a kindness that fixes things beyond wood and screws. It smooths the small abrasions of life. He did that too. Sundays became something I looked forward to again. He'd pick me up for service and wait in the car with a newspaper folded in his lap, but always ready to open the door for me and press my hand gently as I stepped out. After church, we'd go to the diner with the cracked leather booths, where the waitress knew us by name and put our coffee cups within reach before we even sat. He liked the eggs and grits. I liked the way he said grace under his breath, as if he had been reminded to be thankful for something as simple as a warm plate. Sometimes on quiet afternoons he'd try a new recipe, one of his sister's casseroles or a pot of stew, and I'd stand in the kitchen doorway and watch him stir, thinking how strange and lovely it was to see a man move through domestic life with no pretense at all. He came to family dinners, which was a big step for both of us. My daughter Monique watched him with that wary affection only a daughter can wear when she's protecting her mother. The first time he came over for Sunday dinner, Monique set a place and kept an eye on the conversation like a careful gatekeeper. She asked the questions you expect. Where did you work? How long have you been in Charleston? Do you have family nearby? Raymond answered in that measured, patient way of his, and he listened, really listened, when Monique spoke about her work and the kids. After the meal, when she walked me to the kitchen to help with the dishes, she squeezed my arm and said, "I like him, Mama. He's gentle. Just take it slow." I told her I would. I meant it. I didn't want to rush anything. I wanted to be prudent without robbing myself of the calm joy of what was happening. There were small moments that stitched us together. He would come over on a Tuesday just to bring me a newspaper page he thought I'd like, an article about local history or a book review. He'd sit on my porch while I watered the plants, and we'd talk about the things that had shaped us, the teachers we loved, the summers we remembered, the music that always made us feel younger. He shared with me stories of his wife like they were still close, and I listened because that's what you do when someone honors the past while offering the present. It made me feel that he wasn't trying to erase what had been. He was making room for what could be. Sometimes in the soft hush after dinner, we'd sit with our feet up and watch an old film on television, black and white comedies that made us laugh at the same jokes, and I would lean into him like an old coat that felt just right. He'd put his hand on mine and say, "You look peaceful tonight," and I'd think, yes, I do. I had peace again, and it felt as if someone had turned a light on in a room I thought I would only remember from memory. Yet, for all the sweetness, there were the little things that bothered me. Small, almost insignificant at first, like pebbles in a shoe, he would answer some calls away from me, stepping out to the porch or into the garage with a polite, "I'll be right back." And he'd come back with that slight hesitation in his smile. It was the sort of silence that folded itself inward, not loud, but noticeable if you paid attention. Once or twice, when his phone lit up on the kitchen counter and he saw the name, he'd glance at it as if cataloging a disturbance, and then he'd turn the screen face down without explanation. I told myself not to worry. People have friends. People have habits. Maybe it was an old acquaintance, maybe a distant cousin. I reminded myself of the trust I was trying to cultivate, and I let the small noises stay small. There was also the fact that I had never been to his house. We saw each other at my place, at the church, at the diner, or strolling the river walk. He admired my garden and liked the way my windows caught the afternoon light. But he never suggested I come to his house, and when I suggested it, he'd chuckle and deflect. "I'm still settling in," he'd say. "You know how it is. Boxes everywhere. No proper chair to welcome someone." I accepted that explanation, and part of me even believed it. People move slowly in their 70s. There might be reasons that made sense, but there was a small, insistent corner of me that wondered why the man who wanted to build a life with me never wanted to show me the one he'd already built. Still, I learned to cling to the gratitude more than the questions. I would rather eat dinner at home with a good man than sit in a spotless apartment with someone who kept secrets. I chose hope over fear because hope felt like a warm garment, and I was tired of feeling cold. When Monique called to voice concern, she'd say, "Mom, I just don't want you to get hurt." I would answer with honesty and reassurance. "I know, baby," I'd say. "I hear you, but I also see a man who has been kind in ways that matter. I'm not giving my whole heart away. I'm letting myself feel something without throwing caution to the wind." My daughter would murmur, and I could hear the worry in her voice. But she would always end by saying, "Okay, Mama, just promise me you'll be careful." I promised, because I meant it. As the months passed, we began to talk about a future in small, unthreatening ways. He'd say, "If the weather's nice, maybe we could plant some tomatoes this spring." And I'd picture a row of small red globes, a wooden stake, his hands helping mine. We imagined nothing grand, no sudden flights or big houses, just ordinary plans that felt like a bedrock, a shared bench in the garden, maybe a chair at the church potlucks. The word forever was never uttered, at least not seriously, but in the quiet of our evenings, when he'd hold my hand and say something like, "I don't want to spend another winter alone." The implication was there, tender and honest. I found myself thinking that maybe I had room in my life for someone else's company, and the thought made me tender and brave in ways I hadn't been in years. People in the neighborhood smiled when they saw us. Two older folks walking together, slowing down for the squirrels, pausing to buy peaches from the farmer's stand. Mrs. Alvarez next door would bring over a slice of cake and clap her hands at us like proud aunts. The world seemed to grant approval, as if the sight of two people finding comfort in each other was a small miracle worth blessing. It was comforting to be part of a small constellation of approval, to feel like I was re-entering the community in a way that felt safe and real. And yet, even as I let myself bask in the glow of these ordinary joys, the pebbles in my shoe remained. There were nights when he'd come over and his phone would vibrate a dozen times, and he'd glance at it with a look that made me feel slightly off stage, as if some other scene was playing where I wasn't invited. Once, when we were at the Riverwalk and I asked casually about his sister or his friends from Atlanta, he'd smile and redirect, telling a story about a fishing trip instead. I didn't press. I kept my questions gentle. I had learned through grief and loss that you cannot hunt for evidence of love. You have to let it show up in the way someone treats you when no one is watching. And yet curiosity is a human thing. It creeps up like ivy. It begins as a small tendril, and before you know it, it's climbing high. I caught myself at times watching his face when his phone buzzed, trying to read the expression that flickered there. Sometimes it was nothing, just an old joke text. Sometimes it was a look I couldn't quite place. I resolved to be patient. I told myself love deserved that patience. I told myself trust could be rebuilt only by giving it the chance to stand. One evening, standing on my porch with the sky a slow wash of purple, he reached for my hand and said something he'd said many times before. "Evelyn, if you ever need anything, I'm here. For real." His thumb stroked my knuckles as if he was sewing a promise into the moment. My reply was simple. "I know," I said, "and I appreciate you." I meant both truths, the comfort of his presence and the small caution that lived like a grain of salt under my tongue. So we walked forward together, careful and hopeful, building small shared memories. The time we painted the fence and got more paint on our hands than on the wood. The Sunday we fed the ducks and laughed at how clumsy we both were. The holiday when he brought a string of little lights and we draped them across my porch. Life felt gentle, and that gentleness was a kind of mercy I hadn't expected in the last chapters of my life. And even as I savored these moments, I began to notice patterns, subtle, half-hidden things that didn't align with the openness I wanted. He avoided calls in front of me more often. He never invited me to his house, even though he listened to every story I told about my rooms and my past. It made me wonder, but I didn't let the wonder turn loud. I tucked it away like a small, folded note on the shelf and told myself to wait, to watch, and to trust my own feet to know when it was time to stand. The first time I saw the name, it felt like a small stone dropped into a quiet pond. We'd come in from the garden, hands dirt-smudged and cheeks warm, and Raymond had gone straight to the bathroom to rinse his palms. I was wiping the table, humming something old, when his phone buzzed on the counter. It lit up with that soft blue, and there it was. Marie. The letters were bright and ordinary, and for a second I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't mean to look. You tell yourself you won't notice things like that when you're trying to be open, but curiosity is a human thing. It's quieter than pride, and it sneaks in when you're alone and your heart wants a reason. I picked up the tea towel and folded it slowly, watching the light catch the phone. The little buzz went on and then stopped, and Raymond stepped out of the bathroom, hair damp, towel over his shoulder, smiling that patient smile he always gives me. "Someone's got a good sense of humor," he said, reaching for the phone. He didn't check the screen. He'd flipped it face down before I could see more. "Who's Marie?" I asked innocently enough. I wanted it to be a simple answer. I wanted to see the name become nothing. He blinked, and for a moment his face tightened in a way that made me uneasy. Then he laughed softly and said, "Oh, she's an old friend from church. Came through town and was checking in. You know how folks are, always wanting to make sure folks are all right." He moved past me to the sink, like the subject didn't matter. "Don't worry your pretty head about it." He said pretty in that teasing way he used when he wanted me to smile. I smiled because I wanted to. I believed him because I wanted to. But faith is not the same thing as willful ignorance. After he left the room, the tiny seed of doubt set up a quiet household inside me, taking up corner space like a spare chair. The days after that, I tried to be gentle with myself. I told myself that people have names and histories, and that Raymond, like most of us, had a past full of friends who came and went. Maybe Marie was a neighbor from before, maybe a cousin of someone else. The mind is inventive when it wants to be kind. I clung to that invention and let it carry me through Sunday services and cooking, garden work, and evenings by the radio. But the mind is also a good historian. It remembers patterns, so when the phone buzzed again and Raymond stepped away, this time to the porch, closing the door behind him, I felt the old prickle of unease. He'd been careful before, sure, but lately careful had the texture of secrecy. He would say, "It's nothing, Evelyn," and yet his jaw would tighten as if he'd swallowed a sour thing he didn't want me to taste. It wasn't just the calls. Little things stacked up like tiny coins in a jar. One Saturday afternoon, we sat down to pay the utility bills together. He had offered, insisted, on sorting them with me, saying it would be easier with two heads. There was something satisfying about sitting side by side, me with my pencil and ledger, him with his steady hand and the calculator that still winked with digits from some earlier sum. We'd made coffee and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, and for a while it felt like the ordinary partnership I had always imagined. Two people sharing small chores, quiet and companionable. As he slid the paper for the electric bill toward me, I noticed his hand linger on an envelope he'd put aside. It was a plain manila, something you might put receipts in. When he straightened up, his sleeve had ridden back, and there it was, a pale ring mark on the base of his finger. Not a deep groove, not like when one wears a ring for decades, but a faint circle that seemed freshly made, as though a band had been removed in the last few weeks. My chest tightened. I reminded myself of the evenings he'd told me how long he'd and his wife had been married, of the tenderness in his voice when he said her name, Marie. I thought of the way he'd spoken of her with reverence and not bitterness. The mark could be nothing. People take rings off for work, for comfort, for no reason that matters at all. I told myself that. I told myself a lot of things. Still, the mark nudged at the questions that were busy setting up housekeeping in my head. Why had the ring been removed? Had she died? Had they separated? Why hadn't he told me more? The questions were like threads. Pull one and the rest may or may not come undone, but you don't know until you pull. That night, after he had gone to bed, I sat at the table with my ledger and the bills spread out in front of me. The house was quiet except for the clock's slow hand. I found myself thinking of the little ritual we'd developed. Paying bills together, making sure both names were on things where appropriate, talking about the cost of living and the things that mattered. For months he'd been careful, gentle, almost solicitous about money, something that for a retired teacher like me made me feel secure. As I flipped the pages of the ledger and added up numbers, my mind wandered back to the manila envelope. Paper has a way of telling you what you don't want to hear, if you look. It beats in my memory like a soft drum. Over the following week, I watched and listened with the kind of attention I'd once reserved for my students when a lesson needed to be learned. I noticed when Raymond's hand would hover over his phone, when he'd tilt the screen away when I walked into the room. I noticed that certain conversations he had with friends ended abruptly when I stepped up the porch step. I noticed that sometimes he would get a message and excuse himself with a quick, "I'll be right back," and then he'd be gone in the shadow of the garage, where the light fell differently, and the world, I suspected, was not the one he described. I tried to speak gently about it once, to give him space to explain himself. "You seem busy lately," I said one evening as we sat on the couch, the television murmuring in the background. "Everything all right with your friends?" I made it sound casual, a comment about the weather. He folded his hands in his lap and gave me one of those looks that had drawn me to him in the first place. Open, patient, the sort of thing that makes a woman want to trust. "Just old friends," he said. "People from back home who call about this and that. They don't understand the pace of life here." He smiled and then, with a softness that felt meant to soothe the entire room, changed the subject, asking me about a book I'd been reading. I answered him, and the moment slid by without incident. But later, when he was in the garage tinkering with an old radio, I found the courage to slip through his pockets while pretending to look for a screwdriver. It's not something I'm proud of, and part of me still cringes at the act of it, but curiosity had become a kind of necessity. My hand brushed the lining, and a folded scrap of paper moved beneath my fingers. I unfolded it, careful, as if diffusing something, and the name stared back at me. A church program, a card from Marie and family. Her name was accompanied by a note, polite and warm, thanking him for helping with a recent event. The dates were recent. There it was. Paper, very ordinary, very human. It didn't say much, but it said enough. It said that Marie was not just a memory in his voice. She was still present in ink, in events, in the small social contracts of life. I could have folded the paper and put it back, pretended I'd never seen it. But paper has a way of becoming a louder thing the longer you ignore it. That night, I lay awake counting the fan blades on my ceiling, an old habit that my mother taught me when grief made the world loud. I thought of Charles, of how telling the truth had always been a cornerstone in our marriage. I thought of promises and the quiet honesty we had shared, and I wondered why this felt like something being suggested to me in half-whispers and side doors. The doubt had a slow, steady rhythm. It didn't roar. It hummed. Over the next few days, I became an attentive archivist in my own life. I wrote things down, small notes about times and dates when calls had come in, when he'd been distracted, when his hands had been drawn to his phone with a particular urgency. I kept the church card I'd found tucked away, folded and sealed in the back of my desk drawer like an artifact. I didn't confront him. I had learned that confrontation, when done without clarity, is often a theater that leaves you empty. I wanted facts. I wanted the kind of proof that could stand in a room and be questioned calmly. Yet even as I collected evidence, I found it harder to sleep. The house felt different, like the air knew more than I did. There were small betrayals in everyday rituals. He would make a cup of tea and forget to tell me he'd invited someone over last minute. He would mention an event with a kindly chuckle, and then later say he hadn't been able to attend. A web of small inconsistencies wove itself, and when I pulled gently at one thread, another presented itself. It's funny how the heart tries to reconcile facts with the person you love. Part of me wanted to give him the benefit, to find the generous explanation where no malice existed. Maybe there were reasons. Old obligations, a family crisis, some shore I couldn't see. But there is also a practical muscle that grows with age, honed by decades of making decisions and keeping your affairs in order. That muscle told me to be careful, so I grew careful. I watched. I listened. I kept my voice steady when Monique called and asked, "Mama, are you sure?" I told her I was all right, because the truth is, you don't always want to make the people you love more worried than they already are. She urged caution, and I said I would be careful. The thing about being careful is that it is not the opposite of love. Sometimes it's the truest way to keep it. And the more careful I became, the more small things revealed themselves. A receipt tucked into a coat pocket. A scent of perfume on a shirt that smelled like lilies. Subtle, almost indistinguishable from the soap he used. A message left on the answering machine that he'd erased quickly. Not because it was nothing, but because it had meaning he didn't want me to have. Each small discovery didn't scream betrayal. It whispered it. And whispers, as I had learned, can be dangerous if you leave them unacknowledged. I didn't want to be that woman who made a scene at a dinner table. I wanted to be the kind of woman who could stand in truth and be steady. So I practiced stillness. I kept the card, I kept the notes, and I kept my mouth when the urge to ask the hard questions rose like a tide. I told myself that once you have facts, solid, clean facts, you can ask anything without feeling like you're damning yourself with your own imagination. That quiet collection of evidence became my work. It filled the small hours, jotting things down, placing paper in envelopes, forming a small file that, in time, would be more than a suspicion. It would be the architecture of clarity, and in the pauses between the collection and the future reckoning, I tried to be gentle with myself, to remember the taste of warm cornbread and the feeling of summer rain on my face, to hold on to the ordinary joys that made life worth watching and worth living. The moment I decided I would not be ruled by suspicion anymore, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a dramatic thing. No slammed doors or shouted words, just a quiet turning, like a clock hand finding its place. I put the church card into my pocket, the one with Marie's name on it, and I told myself I would not be a woman who stumbled in the dark. I would light a candle and look. I started small, the way teachers begin a lesson, with questions that any sensible person would think harmless. I asked Raymond about the card one afternoon while we were folding laundry together. "You seem to get a lot of mail from church," I said, holding up a sock, trying to sound breezy. He arranged the shirts in a neat stack and looked up at me. "People send things sometimes. Church folks are thoughtful." He didn't meet my eyes for long. He moved the conversation away with a joke about my folding technique. I laughed because that's the place you go when you want the air to stay calm. But I noticed his avoidance, and that notice became homework. I called Monique and told her I wanted her to come by on Saturday. "There's nothing to worry about," I said, which was not entirely honest, but mothers and daughters have a way of understanding respect and caution without needing the whole story. When she arrived, she hugged me like she always has, fierce and brief. And then she sat with me at the kitchen table while I told her what little I'd found. The card, the ring mark, the phone calls polite but secretive. She listened without interrupting, the way she had been trained by years of school teachers and problem sets. Then she said, "Mama, let me help." We began to gather facts in the slow, thorough way I'd taught my students to do research. Monique is a logistician by trade. She knows how to follow paths that hide in plain sight. We made a list. Confirm Raymond's former address, Look for marriage or divorce records at the county clerk's office. See if there were recent checks or receipts that didn't fit the story he'd told. We weren't looking for drama. We were looking for clarity. The county clerk's office was a small room with a faint smell of paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of place that keeps the city honest with its little stamps and signatures. The woman behind the counter asked what I needed, and I told her plainly I wanted to look up a marriage record. "Evelyn Carter," she said with a small smile. "Do you have the date?" I did not. I had a name and a gentle dread, but sometimes you don't need dates to find the truth. The clerk typed and scrolled and then, with a patient frown, said, "There's a Raymond Brooks married to a Marie Brooks in 1978, but there's no divorce filed here." She handed me a photocopy of the marriage certificate like it was a small, ordinary thing, and my hands trembled just a little as I took it. There are different kinds of shock. Some explode. Some dissolve slowly like sugar in hot tea. For me, it was the latter. The sugar dissolved and left something bitter at the bottom of the cup. My knees got a little weak. I thanked the clerk and folded the paper into my purse. When Monique and I walked back to the car, her hand on my shoulder felt like a small, steady anchor. "We'll get to the rest," she said. "We'll do it right." We started to do it right. Monique called Diane, a lawyer she knew from work who specialized in elder law and probate. Diane's voice on the phone was efficient but kind. "Bring whatever you have," she said. "We'll look and advise. Don't make a scene." That, more than anything, felt like manna to me, a practical, professional direction that made the problem less overwhelming. In the days that followed, I collected everything I could think of that might be useful: phone bills, church bulletins, the little card from Marie. I kept them in a folder with a rubber band around it and labeled it in my careful handwriting. Raymond, paper trail. I sat at my kitchen table and made notes. Dates of odd calls, nights he'd stepped outside, the examples of avoidance. I found a few receipts in his jacket pocket when he'd left it on the back of a chair. Small things. A dinner for two at a restaurant that didn't ring any bells in my memory. A floral shop receipt from a delivery address that, when we checked, was his old street in Atlanta. It was quiet work, deliberate and slow. I also spent time watching, but not in the way movies show detectives watching through binoculars. This watching was neighborhood watching, noticing the times he left and returned, the cars that came by for brief visits, the way his voice changed sometimes on the phone when nobody could hear. I learned the rhythm of him as I had learned the rhythm of every child whose attention I'd ever kept. Patterns reveal themselves if you're patient enough to sit with them. One Sunday, I went with a small plan. Raymond had told me about a church event in his neighborhood, and I asked casually if I might accompany him. He paused, then said, "It's mostly folks from home. I don't want to make you feel like an outsider." I assured him I wouldn't mind. That day, the church was warmer than my own Sunday home, the coffee darker, the jokes older. And there, in the pews, with her hair pinned in an old-fashioned knot and a shawl over her shoulders, was Marie. She looked exactly how Raymond had described her in the stories. Soft, kind, with the sort of presence that filled a room like the smell of baking bread. When she stood and the congregation sang, she sang with a familiarity that said she had never left. When our eyes met, through a crossing of glances across the room, something shifted. Marie smiled, and that smile was ordinary and generous. She rose afterward and came to the foyer like someone walking toward a neighbor. She spoke to Raymond with warmth that had years in it. She turned toward me and offered a handshake that felt like a greeting between acquaintances, but the way her eyes lingered on him, and the way he moved in response told a story in a language that had grammar I did not yet understand. After the service, while folks were folding hymnals and offering casseroles, I edged into conversation. I asked about her family, where she was from, if she had children nearby. She spoke with ease about grandchildren and a small garden she tended. "Raymond helped with the roof last winter," she said casually. "We take turns. That's what neighbors do." Her hand brushed his as she reached for a plate, and my note-taking mind logged the contact like it was a fact. Hands touch. Hands no. Later that day, I showed Monique some of the paperwork we'd already gathered. "Mama," she said, turning the marriage certificate over. "It looks like they're still connected." Her voice lowered on the last word like it was a raw thing to say out loud. We made a plan. Diane would request a formal search of court records and see if there had been any filings elsewhere. We would look at bank statements, mine, his, any joint transactions that didn't add up. We would be discreet. We would be deliberate. As we dug, more details came into focus. There were transfers I couldn't account for. Sums that appeared and disappeared in ways that didn't make sense with the story Raymond had told about his retirement projects. There were little things, too. A small postcard mailed to his Atlanta address from a friend who signed off with love and blessings. A photograph tucked into an old Bible showing Raymond and Marie on their wedding day, smiling in a way that made you believe in love's endurance. Each piece of paper was an honest thing, not dramatic in itself, but together they told a history I had only half expected to be true. There were nights when I sat awake thinking of all the conversations I'd had with Raymond. The late-night talks, the promises in the small hours. I remembered his hands on my shoulder the night he said he felt lucky to have me. I remembered how he'd said my laugh sounded like summer rain. Those memories were now knitted into a larger cloth with threads I hadn't seen. That didn't mean the man I had known with my hands and my days was a stranger. It meant he had layers I hadn't been shown. And the hardest part wasn't the layers themselves, but the choice he'd made about where to put me. I didn't rush to confront him. Anger is useful sometimes, but it can also burn bridges you need to cross. I wanted a plan that would stand when the smoke cleared, so I kept my voice calm and my face composed. I wrote letters to myself in the small hours to sort out how I felt. I called Diane and we discussed what legal steps would look like if it came to that. I told Monique to keep watch without making a show of it. We were careful as gardeners pruning a rose bush, cutting away only what was necessary, leaving the core intact for the future. Bitterness tried to creep in, like ivy at the base of a fence. I fed it small slices of imagination and then folded those pages into my wastebasket. I refused to let my story be a reaction. I wanted it to be an action. So every day I would do something ordinary. Water the jasmine, call a friend, feed Pearl, read a chapter of a new novel. And every evening I would add another small piece to the file that sat in my desk drawer. Receipts, dates, notations in my careful hand. It was not a dramatic archive. It was the working library of a woman who'd decided she deserved the truth. And in the quiet between the gathering and the unspooling, something else grew. Not hatred. Not revenge. Not a thirst for ruin, but a steady resolve. I would not be the woman who let a secret settle into her bones. I would not let my trust be spent on a lie. I would find clarity, and then, when the time came, I would choose what to do with it. It's strange how quiet the world can feel when you finally stop pretending. There's a stillness that comes before truth, not like the calm before a storm, but like the silence before dawn. You know something's about to rise, and once it does, there's no going back to darkness. That's how it felt the week I decided to bring everything into the light. By then, I had every piece I needed neatly tucked into a leather folder. Receipts, call logs, transfers, that marriage certificate with the clerk's stamp still faint on the corner. I didn't carry anger in those pages, not anymore. I carried proof, and with it peace. The woman who once trembled holding that document was gone. What remained was someone who had learned that silence can be a shield when you use it right. I planned the dinner carefully, as calmly as if I were setting a table for company. I invited a few close family members, Monique, her husband, my 2 grandsons, and I told Raymond he could invite his sister and a couple of his friends from church. It's been too long since our families sat down together, I said with a smile that didn't waver. He agreed easily, even seemed touched. That's a fine idea, he said, taking my hand. Family's what keeps us grounded. I remember thinking how ironic it sounded, coming from a man with 2 of them. The day came clear and warm, one of those southern evenings where the air hums low and steady. I roasted chicken with rosemary, mashed sweet potatoes, baked biscuits from scratch. It wasn't about revenge, it was about ritual. There's something holy about breaking bread, even when truth is sitting quietly beside the salt shaker. I moved through the motions with deliberate calm, setting the table, lighting candles, laying out napkins. Every action was slow and sure, as if the rhythm itself could steady my heartbeat. When the guests arrived, the house filled with laughter and the sound of chairs scraping against hardwood floors. Monique kissed my cheek and gave me a knowing glance, her eyes steady but soft. She knew this was the night. Raymond's sister, Denise, came in wearing her Sunday hat and hugging everyone with that big church mother energy. Raymond was charming, of course, pulling out chairs, pouring sweet tea, telling stories about how blessed he was to be given a second chance at love. I smiled through it all, my hands folded in my lap, my folder resting quietly under the table like a hidden scripture. We made it through dinner with polite talk and polite smiles, the kind that sits on the surface of things. My grandsons ran through the living room with toy trucks, and I thought how beautiful it was that they'd never yet learned to hide the truth. I envied that innocence for just a moment. Then dessert came, pecan pie still warm, and I knew the time had come. I waited until the table was cleared. The dishes clinked softly in the kitchen sink, and the hum of conversation had settled into that post-meal lull when everyone's guard is down. I placed my hand gently on the folder beside me and looked at Raymond. "There's something I'd like to say before everyone leaves," I said. My voice was calm, too calm maybe, but it carried just enough weight to draw the room's attention. He looked up, still smiling. "Of course, baby," he said. "What's on your mind?" I took a slow breath, one that reached all the way down to my ribs. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It means something. It really does." I paused, letting the silence settle around the table. "And I want to thank you, Raymond, for reminding me of something I'd almost forgotten." He blinked, a faint confusion stirring behind his glasses. "What's that?" "That truth has a way of showing up when it's ready," I said. "And it's ready now." I reached for the folder and laid it on the table. Monique's hand brushed mine for a second, a quiet squeeze, and I opened it slowly. The sound of the paper sliding out was louder than I expected. I set the marriage license down first, the one with his and Marie's names printed clean and legal. Then came the receipts, the bank transfers from my account, the ones he'd convinced me were for shared investments. Then the call logs. I didn't speak at first. I let the silence do the talking. Raymond's face changed, not suddenly, but in small, steady ways. The smile faded. The color drained from his cheeks. "Evelyn," he started, his voice low, uncertain. "What is all this?" "It's the truth," I said quietly. "The one you've been living on two sides of." I met his eyes, and he couldn't hold my gaze. "You told me Marie was your past. You told me she was gone from your life. But this—" I gestured to the paper, to the evidence laid bare on the table. "Says otherwise." He reached for the papers, but I put my hand over them. My touch was firm, not angry, just final. "You don't get to rearrange this," I said softly. "It's not a misunderstanding and it's not a mistake. You've been married this whole time, Raymond, to her, and you've been using me to keep both lives running." He stammered something, half denial, half justification. "Evelyn, it's not like that. Marie and we've been apart for years. I didn't want to hurt you, I just didn't want to get caught." I finished for him. My tone stayed even. "You didn't think a woman my age would look close enough to see the gaps in your story. You thought kindness meant blindness." My heart wasn't racing anymore. The ache had settled somewhere quieter, deeper. "You told me I was your second chance," I said, looking him straight in the eyes. "But I won't be your secret." No one spoke for a long while. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with realization. Denise's mouth was slightly open, her hand frozen halfway to her teacup. Monique sat still beside me, eyes sharp and protective. Even the children, sensing something sacred and dangerous, had gone silent in the next room. Raymond tried to reach across the table, his hand trembling. "Please, baby," he said, his voice cracking. We can talk about this. I can fix it. There's nothing to fix, I said. There's just what's true. I stood then, pushing my chair back with the gentlest scrape. I'm not angry anymore, Raymond. That's the part that surprises me most. I thought I would be, but I'm not. I'm just done. I gathered the papers back into the folder, stacked them neatly, and closed it with a quiet snap. Then I looked around the room, at my daughter, at my grandsons peeking from the hallway, at his stunned sister. I'm sorry you had to see this, I said softly, but it needed to be seen. Some truths deserve witnesses. I walked to the hallway where my bag and coat waited. Raymond followed a few steps behind, still trying to form sentences that came out like broken glass. You can't just walk away, he said. We can work through this. I love you. I paused at the door, my hand on the knob, and turned to look at him. The man who had once made me laugh in the garden now looked small. Not because I wanted him to, but because deceit shrinks a person's soul until all that's left is the outline. Maybe you do, I said quietly, but not in a way that keeps anyone whole. Outside, the evening air met me like a blessing. Cool, still carrying the scent of the meal I'd cooked, of rosemary and truth. I walked to my car, set the folder on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the wheel. I didn't cry. There were no tears left for this, just breath, long, deep, and steady. When I finally started the car, I glanced back toward the house one last time. Through the window, I could see Raymond standing in the doorway, the porch light washing him in a pale gold that made him look older than he was. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. As I pulled away, the road ahead looked clearer than it had in a long time. My mind was quiet. My body felt light. There's a kind of freedom that doesn't come from winning or losing. It comes from stepping out of a lie and into your own name again. I knew that's where I was headed now. Home. Not the one he'd promised, but the one I was finally choosing for myself. And as the streetlights flickered past and the night unfolded around me, one thought kept me steady. I hadn't lost anything that was truly mine. What I had lost was the illusion, and the space it left behind was something I could finally fill with peace. It's been a year now since I packed up the pieces of that life and started over. Quietly, gently, and entirely on my own terms. I remember that first morning waking up in my new place. The sound of seagulls outside and the smell of salt drifting through the open window. The world felt wide again. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. For the first time in a long time I could breathe without checking who might be listening. The cottage I live in now sits at the edge of a small, coastal town, one of those quiet corners of South Carolina where the tide keeps its own time and the neighbors still wave when they pass by. It's not fancy. Not like the home I once imagined building with Raymond. But it's mine. Every inch of it. The deed bears my name alone. And that small truth, those printed letters, feel heavier and holier than any diamond ever could. I didn't buy it for size or show. I bought it for peace. And peace, as I've learned, doesn't take up much room. It just asks to be honored. The days here are simple in the way good days often are. I wake early, make my coffee, and sit by the window where the light pours in gold and soft. The mornings are my favorite, that quiet hour before the world starts humming. I'll open the window just enough to hear the ocean breathing in and out. Sometimes I think that sound has become my heartbeat, steady, sure, and unhurried. I used to wake in the middle of the night and reach for someone beside me, the space cold and waiting. Now, when I wake, I just roll onto my back and smile at the ceiling, knowing that peace has taken that place. I started volunteering at the library a few months after moving here. The first day I walked in, the smell of books hit me like a memory from childhood. That mix of paper and polish that always feels like promise. They asked if I'd be willing to help with the children's reading group. You were a teacher? The librarian asked. I nodded. All my life, I said. And it felt good to say that. To remember who I was before love and loss became the main headlines of my story. The kids call me Miss Evelyn. They sit in a half circle every Tuesday afternoon, wiggly and loud. But when I start reading, they fall quiet in that magic way only stories can make happen. Their faces light up when the good parts come, their little mouths hanging open at twists and turns. Every time I see that wonder, that wide-eyed faith that stories can turn out right, I feel something inside me knitting back together. Maybe we never lose that part of ourselves completely. Maybe we just forget where we left it. After the library, I'll come home, slip off my shoes, and head straight to the garden. The roses were stubborn at first, the soil here sandy and dry, but I kept at it, pruning, watering, coaxing them along with patience and quiet talk. My mother used to say plants can tell when you're speaking from your heart. Maybe that's true because by late summer the first buds opened like small pink secrets. I stood there that morning with dirt under my nails and tears on my cheeks. Not because the roses were beautiful, though they were, but because they'd grown out of care, not control. Out of steady tending, not fear. It reminded me that the heart works the same way. Every so often I think about Raymond. Not in anger, not in longing, just as a chapter I've finished reading. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that things didn't end well between him and Marie. That news didn't bring me joy, just understanding. People who live by lies often end up tangled in them, and I had no interest in watching that play out. I wished him peace, quietly, and moved on. I don't check his social pages. Don't ask around. Don't replay the words we said that night. I learned that forgiveness isn't saying it's okay. It's saying it's over. The funny thing is, I don't feel alone anymore. My solitude feels full of sound and scent and meaning. My house hums with little things that make me happy. The soft hiss of the kettle, the creak of the old rocking chair, the gentle purr of my cat sleeping in the sunlight. My life used to be filled with someone else's noise. Now it's filled with my own quiet, and I find I prefer the company. Every now and then, on Sundays, I drive out to the riverbank near the old church, not to attend service, just to sit under the oak tree and watch the light move through the water. I think about how different I am from the woman who first met Raymond at a potluck and thought her life had been given a second bloom. I'm softer now, but stronger too. I know how to listen to my instincts, how to read between the lines of someone's promises, and more than anything, I know how to love myself without apology. People talk about revenge like it's fire, something that burns bright and leaves nothing behind. But I've learned that real revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the sound of laughter returning after silence. It's a woman buying her own house with her own money and signing her own name. It's a heart that still believes in goodness, not because of someone else, but despite them. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making them pay. It's making peace, and knowing they'll never break you again. That thought used to sound like strength. Now it feels like freedom. I sit with it often, especially in the evenings when the day folds itself into a soft hush. I light a candle, open the window, and listen to the world outside. The faint murmur of waves, the song of a night bird, the steady rhythm of the wind against the porch screen. These are my witnesses now. They remind me that I'm still here, still breathing, still blooming. One afternoon not long ago, I caught my reflection in the window. Not the woman I used to be, not the one who lived through heartbreak, but someone new, someone content in her own skin. My hair's a little grayer now. My laugh line's deeper, but my eyes are clear. I think they finally match the way I feel inside. Unburdened. Whole. I smiled at that reflection and whispered to her, "You made it." And for the first time, I truly believed it. Sometimes, when people ask about my life, neighbors, new friends, folks at the library, I tell them it's quiet, and they smile as if that's a lesser thing. But quiet is its own kind of music. You learn to hear yourself in it. You learn to see how far you've come. I don't need excitement anymore. I've had enough of that kind of noise. What I crave now is steadiness. Mornings that begin with sunlight instead of secrets. Nights that end in peace instead of pretending. And I have that now. Every single bit of it. As I sit here tonight, the sun is slipping low over the water, painting the sky with that honey-colored light I've come to love. My roses sway gently in the breeze, and I can smell their sweetness through the screen door. The kettle whistles in the kitchen, soft and familiar. And I think to myself, this right here, is what a real second chance looks like. Not the kind someone gives you, but the kind you build with your own hands. If you've been listening to my story, I hope it leaves something gentle behind in you. A reminder that peace isn't weakness, that walking away can sometimes be the bravest kind of justice, that even after betrayal, there's still life, still warmth, still beauty waiting for you when you choose yourself first. And if this story touched your heart, share it. Tell someone who might need to hear it that healing is quiet but possible, and stay a while with me here on Quiet Justice, where every story finds its peace, one truth at a time.